For years, the relationship between the United States and Canada rested on a quiet idea. There was not always harmony, there was not always goodwill, there were not always smiles, but there was a line that almost no one dared to cross. Politics could harden, speeches could turn aggressive, negotiations could become tense. They could clash over steel, over aluminum, over cars, over subsidies, over quotas, over almost anything. But in the end, there was still an assumption underneath it all. The assumption that the system had to remain stable. Because when two countries live connected by trade, supply chains, energy, manufacturing, investment, transportation, and agreements that sustain jobs on both sides of the border, political noise can rise. But no one plays too recklessly with the structure. No one hits the foundations too hard. No one sets fire to the house they share. And then Donald Trump returned, and with him, a much more dangerous idea came back than a simple trade dispute. The idea that the United States could use its economic weight not just to pressure Canada, but to reorder Canadian politics from the outside. The idea that Washington could look at Ottawa and say, in essence, you depend on us more than we depend on you. So if we harden the tone, if we tighten trade, if we let the clock keep running, if we make the future of the agreement more uncertain, you will have to give in. On paper, it looked like a logical gamble. Canada is not bigger than the United States. It does not have the same economic size. It does not have the same market mass, and its trade relationship with Washington remains central to its stability. That is why, from the rawest logic of power, the move seemed perfect. For years, the relationship between the United States and Canada rested on a quiet idea. There was not always harmony. There was not always goodwill. There were not always smiles. But there was a line that almost no one dared to cross. Politics could harden, speeches could turn aggressive, negotiations could become tense. They could clash over steel, over aluminum, over cars, over subsidies, over quotas, over almost anything. But in the end, there was still an assumption underneath it all. The assumption that the system had to remain stable. Because when two countries live connected by trade, supply chains, energy, manufacturing, investment, transportation, and agreements that sustain jobs on both sides of the border, political noise can rise. But no one plays too recklessly with the structure. No one hits the foundations too hard. No one sets fire to the house they share. And then Donald Trump returned, and with him, a much more dangerous idea came back than a simple trade dispute. The idea that the United States could use its economic weight not just to pressure Canada, but to reorder Canadian politics from the outside. The idea that Washington could look at Ottawa and say, in essence, you depend on us more than we depend on you. So if we harden the tone, if we tighten trade, if we let the clock keep running, if we make the future of the agreement more uncertain, you will have to give in. On paper, it looked like a logical gamble. Canada is not bigger than the United States. It does not have the same economic size. It does not have the same market mass, and its trade relationship with Washington remains central to its stability. That is why, from the rawest logic of power, the move seemed perfect. Trump was not pressuring a distant rival. He was not striking a disconnected economy. He was squeezing exactly the point where Canada, in theory, was supposed to feel most vulnerable. And not only that, he was doing it at a moment when Mark Carney was not leading a majority government. He was leading a minority government, a government that by definition looked more exposed, more constrained, more fragile, more forced to negotiate every move. And that was the heart of the calculation. Washington could assume that a minority leader is easier to corner, that a prime minister who does not fully control parliament is slower, more vulnerable, and easier to wear down, that all it takes is enough outside pressure and internal weakness will do the rest. In other words, the strategy was not only commercial, it was political. It was a bet that Trump's pressure would not just make Canada uncomfortable, it would divide it. It would make it more nervous, more disordered, more uncertain about itself. And when a foreign capital begins to smell parliamentary fragility in its opponent, the same temptation almost always appears. Push harder, move faster, apply pressure at the exact moment the other side looks least capable of sustaining a coherent response. That seemed to be what was happening here, because while North America's most important trade agreement was entering a new phase of tension, Washington made it clear that it was not thinking in terms of a short or clean dispute. On April 7th, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said that talks over the USMCA would likely stretch beyond July 1st, 2026, and signaled that talks with Canada would begin in May. He also made it clear that Washington remained deeply dissatisfied with parts of the agreement, especially over rising imports of cars, steel, and aluminum from Canada and Mexico. That did not sound like a simple technical review. It sounded like a warning, like a way of telling Ottawa that time would not be on its side, that the pressure would remain, that the uncertainty would keep growing, that the Canadian government could not count on a quick exit, and that in the meantime, Washington was prepared to keep the threat hanging in the air. That is the kind of environment that can break weak governments. That is the kind of environment in which an opposition grows more aggressive, allies grow nervous, markets begin to recalculate, and the image of leadership erodes little by little. Or at least that was the theory. But this is where the story begins to turn, because there is one mistake great powers make again and again. They confuse size with control. They confuse force with precision. They confuse pressure with results. And when that happens, something can occur that looks small from the outside, until suddenly it changes the entire board. In this case, that turn came in the form of a single seat. Just one. Reuters reported that after conservative lawmaker Marilyn Gladu left the opposition to join the Liberals, Mark Carney's government stood at 171 of the 343 seats in the House of Commons, just one seat short of a majority. It was not an isolated move. It was the fifth defection from the opposition to the Liberals since November. Viewed superficially, it might seem like just another detail of Canadian politics, another defection, another reshuffle, another parliamentary episode. But it's not, because when a defection repeats itself, it stops being anecdotal. When a majority starts to feel reachable, the temperature of the political center begins to change. When a minority government is only one step away from full control, the perception of fragility begins to disappear. And in politics, perception matters as much as arithmetic. Suddenly, the leader who looked cornered no longer looks so cornered. The government that seemed forced to survive week to week starts to look like a power in expansion. And the outside pressure that was supposed to expose weakness begins to have a completely different effect. It starts to organize. It starts to discipline. It starts pushing political actors toward the very center that was supposed to be weakened. That's what makes this story so dangerous for Trump. Because one thing is to pressure a rival. It's something very different to pressure him in such a way that you end up helping him consolidate authority inside his own country. That's the kind of reversal that doesn't always show up immediately. It doesn't explode in the first headline. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't come with a spectacular scene. It's built quietly. First, an atmosphere of threat, then a sense of national urgency. Then political actors begin concluding that weakening the government is no longer convenient. Then defections, then polling, then a new perception of stability, then a majority that no longer feels impossible. And when that happens, the story is no longer the one Washington thought it was writing. Because Trump didn't just want to pressure Canada, he wanted that pressure to produce a political translation. He wanted Ottawa to feel the cost. He wanted Carney to look limited. He wanted the absence of a majority to function like a crack. He wanted that crack to widen. But what is beginning to happen is exactly the opposite. Reuters itself reported that Carney has said a majority would help him respond more effectively to Trump's trade measures. That turns external pressure into an internal political argument. It's no longer just a bilateral threat. It becomes a direct reason to ask for more power, more cohesion, and more room to maneuver. And that changes the entire logic of the confrontation. Because in that moment, Trump stops appearing only as the leader hitting Canada. He begins to look like the leader giving Carney the perfect justification to strengthen his government. That's the kind of irony that makes an apparently technical story feel historic. A trade dispute can be important, a review of the USMCA can be important, a diplomatic clash can be important, but when outside pressure begins to redraw the internal balance of the country receiving the blow, the story changes scale. It's no longer only about trade, it's about power.
And in this case, power is beginning to move in a direction Washington probably never wanted to see, because the narrative Trump seemed to want was very clear. The United States as the dominant force, Canada as the dependent partner, Carney as the limited leader, Washington as...
And this is where the story stops being just a dispute between two governments. Because one thing is for Trump to want to pressure Canada. It is something very different for that pressure to begin changing Canadian politics from the inside. That is the point where this story becomes truly dangerous for Washington. Because on the surface, everything looked fairly clear. The White House was hardening the environment. The USMCA was entering a new phase of uncertainty. The clock kept moving. Canada was still the smaller country, and Mark Carney was still governing without an absolute majority. On paper, the scene looked favorable for Trump. But the problem with pressure-based strategies is that they often work very well in the abstract until they come into contact with real politics. And real politics rarely reacts in a clean way. Because when a country feels that its stability, its sovereignty, or its room to maneuver is beginning to be threatened from the outside, what often happens is not weakness. It is a closing of ranks. Not always immediately, not always loudly, not always with a big national speech. Sometimes it begins as an intuition, as a shared discomfort, as a quiet sense that this is not the moment to keep wearing down the government. And little by little, that intuition turns into political behavior. That is exactly what may be happening in Canada. Because what looked like a phase of outside pressure turned, almost without warning, into a moment of internal reorganization. Reuters reported that after Marilyn Gladue left the conservative ranks to join the Liberals, Mark Carney's government stood at 171 of 343 seats, just one short of a majority. It was not an isolated episode. It was the fifth defection from the opposition to the Liberals since November. In addition, Carney has said that a majority would allow him to respond more effectively to Trump's trade policies. That may sound technical, but it is not. Because a majority is not just a number. A majority changes the climate. It changes the speed. It changes the confidence. It changes the perception of leadership. A minority government lives under permanent suspicion. Every important vote becomes a test. Every outside negotiation feels heavier. Every foreign threat can be amplified internally because everyone knows the political margin is narrow. But when that government starts moving closer to a majority, the psychology of the system changes. Suddenly, the leader who looked provisional no longer looks so provisional. The executive that looked constrained begins to look more and more central. Political actors stop asking how long it will last and begin asking whether it is actually consolidating. That change is enormous, because in politics, the perception of inevitability matters immensely. If a government looks weak, more actors feel tempted to challenge it. If a government starts to look dominant, more actors feel tempted to move closer to it. And when that transition happens right in the middle of an outside threat, the effect becomes even stronger. Because then the calculation stops being merely partisan. It becomes national. That means some lawmakers, some sectors, some voters, and some observers may begin thinking something like this. Maybe I am not thrilled with everything this government is doing, but in the middle of pressure from Washington, weakening it now would be even more costly. That kind of thinking changes entire systems, and that is precisely the kind of thinking Trump seems to have activated without intending. AP reported that Gladue pointed to Trump's threats against Canada's sovereignty and economy, as well as recent tariffs, as part of the reason for her decision to join the Liberal Party. That means Trump's pressure is not functioning only as a bilateral force. It is functioning as a reordering force inside Canadian politics. And that is where the hardest irony appears. Trump wanted Canada to feel more divided, but he may have helped certain Canadian sectors feel a greater urgency to reinforce the center. Trump wanted Carney to look limited, but he is giving him the perfect argument to ask for more room to maneuver. Trump wanted parliamentary vulnerability to function like a crack, but outside pressure is beginning to turn that crack into a point of political closure. That is a full-scale reversal of power.
And it is the kind of reversal that almost never arrives with a visible explosion. It does not erupt overnight. It does not come wrapped in a grand ceremony. It is not announced as a victory. It accumulates. First, an atmosphere of threat, then a sense of urgency, then small movements inside Parliament, then a new reading of leadership, then a majority that no longer seems impossible. And by the time actors understand that this is happening, the process is often already advanced enough that reversing it becomes very difficult. That is what makes this stage so delicate. Because if Trump were only raising trade tensions, it would already be an important story. If he were only hardening the tone around the USMCA, it would already be a serious story. If he were only making the bilateral relationship more uncertain, it would already be a huge problem. But if on top of all that, he is also helping reorganize the Canadian center around Carney, then this stops looking like a trade fight and starts looking like a badly calibrated operation. Because trade disputes can be corrected. Speeches can change, negotiating teams can rotate, tariffs can be adjusted. What is much harder to reverse is a new distribution of legitimacy inside the country you were trying to pressure. And that legitimacy appears to be moving. Not because Carney has become invincible, he has not. Not because Canada has stopped depending deeply on the United States, it has not.